you brought under my eye some of the books of the Platonists translated from Greek into Latin. There I read, not of course in these words, but with the entirety of the same sense, and supported by numerous and various reasons, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him nothing was made. And what was made is in him was life, and the life was the light of all men. And the light shone in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Again I read there that the Word, God, is born not of the flesh, nor of blood, nor of the will of man, or of the flesh, but of God. But that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, I did not read there. This chapter is either one of your favorite chapters or one of your least favorite, because Augustine shifts fully into philosophy mode. And when Augustine shifts fully into philosophy mode, what often is going to happen is that the personal examples and experiences of his life will be kind of shelved to the side for a moment in order for him to deal with a particularly important piece of theology or philosophy, and he will try to do it from the fairest angle possible from his perspective, while also trying to maintain that this is still an ongoing process for him as he explores more about, really, his conversion of life into Christianity. Now, there needs to be some explanation before we start, though, because there are some various things he talked about that he assumes the reader knows is relatively the same subject, but for us more modern readers of Augustine might miss whenever he speaks about the Platonic ideas that he's going to deal with. And so what we're going to do very quickly is give a little bit of an overview as to what exactly Augustine is meaning by the Platonists and why exactly he's so interested in the concept in the Johannine books of the New Testament that speaks of the Word of God, the capital W Word of God. Plato, the well-known Greek philosopher, proposes that the universe is made up of matter and immaterial. So there is stuff of the world and there is non-physical stuff that is made up of the world. And in a large part, Plato's conception of what the world is made out of is kind of confined to the good being the spiritual, which for Plato is the non-material, and the evil, or at least the illusory being the physical. I don't believe that it's fair to say that Plato calls the physical world evil. Rather, I think it's more appropriate for Plato to call the physical world non-real. The physical world is in a state of unrealness in comparison to the spiritual world. But how did we get the physical world? Well, the physical world, as Plato's famous example of the cave shows. By the way, you can look up Plato's cave for free online and read it. It's not a very long read, but the gist of Plato's cave is that the physical world is as if we were in a dark cave and the fire is casting shadows on the wall. And when we look at the physical world, we are merely beholding these kind of wispy shadows of what the real world is. What we have to do in Plato's example is we have to get out of the cave in order to see the world clearly. And the ways in which he's going to use this as a metaphor or an example of his philosophy is that the physical world is made up of shades of what the true forms of the world really are. For example, there is a perfect version of this cup that exists. This cup right here, along with the material that this is made out of, is a mere shadow, a shadow of the true form of what this is supposed to be. But the true form does exist. It's not a fake form. The true form exists in, we'll call it heaven. And in the heavens, the true form is casting itself into the world, but not in the truest sense possible. That form is being reflected in this form of the cup, but the true form is not this cup. It is the spiritual form of which we only have access through the mind. The sight of the mind is what we have to use in order to get the true image of, or not simply image, the true form of the cup, or to comprehend the true form of the cup. In that way, there has to be some way of mediating the true form to the physical world. And this was, within Greek philosophy, within Plato's philosophy, the concept of the word. Now, again, it's hard for us to differentiate the word in the Platonic sense from the word in the Christian sense, but that's actually for some good reason, because it is so highly likely that St. John's community, in John's Gospel, in the letters of St. John, in the Revelation, it is so highly likely that John's community was using the idea of the Platonic word to talk about Jesus, that it's hard to differentiate between these two things. Hence why Augustine, when he begins to read the Platonists, all of a sudden immediately recognizes the New Testament's discussion of the Word of God. So, anyway, the Word in Platonic philosophy is the creative force that gives rise to the creation of the world. And the Word that proceeds, that enlivens, that enfleshes, it's hard to say specifically, because of the way that Plato's philosophy is very different than how we think about scientifically. For Plato, to behold something was actually to take something into yourself. And whenever you're looking at something, when you're beholding, again, when you're casting your mind onto what this is, Plato is going to insist that we cannot simply use the physical sight of which to behold these things. Again, we need to differentiate between the shadows on the cave wall versus the true forms, which Plato is going to say can only be comprehended by use of the mind. The mind being the immaterial portion of what it means to be human, and the mind, the logic, really, being that which transcends the shadowy temptations of the passions. Remember how we talked about last week how the passions, when Augustine talks about passions, he's not talking about being interested in something. My passion is for woodworking. My passion is for art. That's not what Augustine means. What he means by passion is the parts of myself that I cannot control, and the things that I need to subdue in order to, by my mind, be able to comprehend the true things of the world. This is, again, it's not going to be exhaustive, but this is a good enough example of Platonic philosophy that we can make some connection points between what Augustine talks about and what he talks about when he encounters the Platonists. When Augustine is beginning to differentiate himself from the Manichaeans, and likewise from the other philosophies that he's encountering, he is looking for an avenue to be able to describe the truth that he is seeking. And one of the things that he is going to deal with in this chapter is going to be a really subtle thing that is easy to miss, but it's deeply important, which is, what is God made of and what is evil made of? you might have caught that in a couple of chapters that we've talked about so far, because this is such a centrally important thing for Augustine. But Augustine's dissatisfaction with Manichaeism really begins when there was a failure of being able to describe how the physical world is actively evil, or how the physical world is by fiat evil, is naturally evil, is by its own architecture evil. Because Augustine, with counterexamples, can describe the world as being mediators of good things. And why is it that the physical world can be mediators of good things if the physical world is only evil? And again, poking holes in some of the Manichaean philosophy, where there was not a clean answer for Augustine, even from Faustus, whom he assumed was going to be able to put his mind at ease on these things. But that being said, Augustine is still struggling with how can the world be a mediator of something that's good when it should be that the physical world is made up of evil things. But also, it poses the question of what is the nature of God and what is the nature of the world? What is also the nature of evil in relationship to God? And what is the relationship of God in relationship to the physical universe as it pertains to the action or overlap of God with the physical universe, if there is one? He finds in the Platonists answers to his questions. Again, Plato, in converse to the Manichaees, is going to say that it's not that the world is actively evil. It's not that the world is made up of this sort of evil race of beings, as Augustine notes that Manichaeans would say. The world is not made up of these evil things around us trying to distract us from the true good. What Plato is going to more in line say is that the world, as we view it merely through the physical actions of our senses, is not the truest nature of the world. It's not that the desk or the cup is actually trying to deceive me. It's that the world is not, we don't view the world in the truest sense unless we use our mind's eye rather than our physical sight. We need to see beyond the shadows of the forms, and we need to see into the true forms. This is where the concept of the Word in connection to God makes a lot of sense for Augustine. Because if the Word, the creative Word, is truly a revelation of the nature of God, then that would differentiate God from the world in a significant sense. For Manichaeism, you have to postulate if the physical world is actively evil. Now, again, let's pay careful attention to this language. If the physical world is by necessity evil, if physical stuff is by necessity evil, my body, the cup, the desk, the books, if by necessity the physical nature of the world is evil, then that means that there is an opposing force of good that cannot, by definition, be these things. If the cup is evil, good can't be the cup. It would be a contradiction of terms to call something both good and evil at the same time. It can be one or the other in the truest sense of the logical term. In other words, if we postulate that God is perfectly good, God cannot be evil. By definition, if God is perfectly good. Now, if we say that humans are a combination of good things and evil things, we have to then figure out where the source of those good things are and where the source of those evil things are. Hence why Manichaeans will then say that, well, humans are made up of two substances, the physical and the non-physical. The physical being what you see, the non-physical being the soul, the mind, something along those lines. Therefore, We don't seek to support the physical, we seek to destroy the physical. Instead, we seek to convert the physical into the spiritual. Hence why Manichaeans will say that when you eat, even though eating is a physical process, you are actually eating and transforming the food of the physical universe into spirits. And this was something that Augustine mentioned a couple of chapters ago as being something that Manichaeans will say is actually happening. Now, Plato, on the other hand, is going to say that it's not that the physical world is evil actively. It's that simply the physical world is incomplete naturally. The physical world is a shadow of the true forms which are in heaven. Again, shadows are the outlines of true forms. If I were to shine a light on this cup against the wall, I would certainly see the shadow of the cup. That shadow is not an evil form of this cup. It's simply a deficient form of this cup. The shadow on the wall is two-dimensional. This is three-dimensional. The shadow on the wall is black and kind of amorphous. It has color and markings and writings and little details that you won't be able to notice against the wall. Again, it's not that the shadow on the wall is an evil thing, it's that it's a deficient thing. It's not sufficient for us to understand the nature of the world. In the same way, God is not the shadows cast on the wall. God, in the Platonic sense, is the truest form of God. And that truest form of God is mediated not by these sort of incomplete shadows, but rather we have to comprehend the word by the non-physical nature of our minds. That avoids the problem that Augustine was having of God being involved or God being involved in a literal fashion with the physical universe in the same sort of fashion in which evil and good are involved. Now, it's not that God is not involved intimately with the universe in some way, shape, or form, but in the nature of evil and good, it cannot be the way that the Manichaeans see it, for Augustine's opinion. However, Platonists also have an interesting view of what exactly it means to view God, because it's kind of one of those things where it's hard for us to talk about Plato as being a monotheist, because really the word for Plato was not necessarily like a monotheistic God, although you could make an argument that that could be a logical end to what Plato was talking about. But I don't think it's fair to Plato, and I don't think it's a good reading of Plato to view Plato as simply a monotheist. However, there are notions in Plato that can support a monotheistic outlook on the world. Hence why I think there's some important sharing of ideas between Plato's philosophy and the Johannine community's writing of the New Testament, the John's Gospel letters and the Revelation, but also St. Paul. Paul was very much a student of Greek philosophy. You can see in Paul's writing some fairly clear markings that Paul knew his way around Greek philosophy. And Paul had a pretty good grasp of what exactly he was dealing with when he was trying to evangelize the Gentiles, when he was using certain kinds of Greek concepts and certain kinds of what he would probably refer to as secular concepts in order to speak about Jesus. But before we get there, Augustine has discovered this about Platonism. What Augustine then has to figure out is what is the connective tissue between God and evil now. There is a really interesting example that Augustine gives, and this has to do with astrology. When he was talking with someone who was more convinced of astrology than he was at that moment, he was reminded of an example that someone had given him, that there was, just so happened, according to what he had heard, there were two women who were pregnant at the same time. And to give an astrological reading of the destiny of a person, it involved careful observation of the stars in relationship to when certain things happen in linear time. So it just so happened that these two women gave birth at basically the exact same point in time. If they gave birth at the exact same point in time, Augustine says, then the astrologers themselves say they should have the same horoscope. They should have the exact same stars. They should have the exact same destiny. And yet, it just happens that the two women who gave birth to their children, one woman was a free noble lady, one woman was a slave. And Augustine then starts turning over in his head the reasoning why it is ridiculous to believe that the stars of these two people would ever have been able to say that they would have had the same destiny, because they demonstrably did not have the same destiny. And not only that, but they demonstrably had a significant different experience of the world in their lives. One was born into slavery, and for at least Augustine's reporting after the fact, never was a free person. The other was a free person who was well educated. And yet, Augustine points out that the temptation of being able to read, just without even consulting the stars, of reading the destinies between these two people, you would be tempted, and Augustine believes that appropriately so, you'd be tempted to read the destiny of this free woman and her child as having a more positive possibility of life, or a more positive reading of the stars, than you would be for this slave woman. Now again, this is a sort of an example that Augustine gives, regardless of the morality of the situation. The point that Augustine was trying to make is that if the stars were an indicator of the destinies of these two people, should it not be that they would have had the same trajectory of their destinies, when in fact they had polar opposites? One is this way, one is that way. That's what Augustine was trying to deal with in that sense. But in the middle of that, what Augustine is trying to highlight is that if it should be that the stars, or God in the biggest sense, had some sort of indication as to how the destinies of these two people were going to work from an exterior point of view, should it not be that that should be obvious to us if it should be the stars that determine that? Augustine says that no, that's not an accurate account of the world. Therefore, there is a level at which God's involvement in the world, and again, Augustine is convinced that God's involved in the world, but Augustine is trying to figure out how God's involved in the world. Because one person was destined for goodness, and one person seemed to have been destined for evil. It's not fair, it's not good, and Augustine is trying to figure out if that should have been the case, then we seem to be making the same mistake about who God is in relationship to how the destinies of these two people worked from a physical reading of the universe. From that point of view, Augustine looks to the Platonists and says there's something to this. The shadows cast into the world give us an incomplete notion of what the nature of God really is, what the nature of the world really is, and because of that incomplete notion, we are given some level of understanding that we're not going to be able to understand perfectly why the world functions in the way it does. This is one of the strengths of Neoplatonic philosophy, is that Neoplatonic philosophy, when we're talking about the nature of the world, is not going to give you a clean answer as to necessarily as to the nature of things, but rather it's going to tell you that there is more to the world than meets the eye, which, again, is something that Christians can also say fully. But the ways in which we say that are markedly different in a couple of key areas. First one is the nature of physicality. When Augustine begins to really dive into the nature of what it means to be physical, there's also a key difference between Platonism and Christianity, which is that for Platonists, the world is illusory, or at least shadowy. The things that we behold by our eyes are not the real things. And because they're not the real things, we have to use our mind to comprehend that which is beyond the thing that I'm looking at. I need to comprehend the shadow of the cup and look beyond the shadow into the perfect cup. I need to recognize that I'm beholding a shadow of something rather than the true nature of the thing. That's what Platonists would say. However, Christians are going to say something different, which is that, no, the physical world is a real representation of reality. And in fact, the physical world is a good representation of reality. It's neither shadowy nor illusory. It's very real. It's, in other words, when I look at the cup, I'm not being deceived by the cup. When I look at the cup, my eyes, my physical sight is not deceiving me that this is a cup. That this is the true nature of the thing. It is a physical thing. And that for Christians, creation, cup, books, desk, things like that, creation is not illusory. And in fact, creation is a good thing. It is neither fake in the sense of which it's not simply a shadow on the wall, but it also is not evil. It also is good by its nature, which is, again, remarkable for Augustine, because he's coming from Manichaeism, which says exactly the opposite of what Christianity is going to say about this. Instead of the world being actively evil and trying to deceive us, the world is actually actively created good. But now Augustine has to figure out, but evil is still present in the world. Here's a key insight that affects Augustine's conception of evil, and also, by the way, affects Christian conceptions of evil for thousands of years after this, which is Augustine's coming to the realization, or coming to the theology, of evil as what we call a privation of that which is good. A type of example of this, or at least a metaphor of this, can be the law of entropy. So the law of entropy, in the physical sense, says that systems as it comes to closed systems of the physical universe, are prone to additions of chaos in the system. That's a really fancy way of saying that things become more disorganized over a longer period of time. Over a long period of time, if there's no energy input into the system, systems will naturally become disorganized. If I leave my cup for long enough with my coffee inside, that coffee will eventually become rancid. The cup, after a long period of time, will eventually begin to deteriorate. By the way, if I leave my cup out in the sun for long enough, the sun's rays on this cup will eventually begin to break down the nature of what the physical item is. And we see that within lots of various things. The law of entropy is basically, if there's no energy being put into a system, then that system will be prone towards disorganization. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because in the nature of evil for Augustine, if it should be that the physical world is good and not evil, if it should be that God is perfectly good and there's no evil found within God, then there are two particular theologies that therefore cannot exist coinciding with these views. Nature cannot be evil then. And if nature is not evil, evil has to be something outside of nature's own capacity for good. And if nature is not found within creation and not found within God, evil cannot be a creation of God. God cannot, by logical necessity, create that which is antithetical to himself. If that's the case, what do we say about evil then? Augustine has a really interesting answer to this question. In that evil, Augustine postulates, does not have existence in and of itself, and therefore evil is not something that has a positive nature to itself, as if it's a created thing. Evil instead has the inverse of what it means to be created. Evil instead is the inverse of nature, the inverse of goodness. And if it's the inverse of goodness, then Augustine postulates evil is that thing which is the absence of good, the absence of creation, the absence of that which is God. Therefore, Augustine would postulate, evil is like rot. When you leave an apple out for too long, the apple eventually begins to decompose. Now, it doesn't become not apple anymore. It just becomes a lessened version of the apple. It's not, as Augustine would say, it's not what the apple is supposed to be. So there's still that Platonic sense of which there is a best nature of something. There is a best version of something. But that apple is, as it decomposes, as it becomes wrinkly, as it becomes rotten, it's not any less an apple. It's simply a deficient version of an apple. It's deficient in the sense that the goodness of which its architecture, the architecture of the apple's goodness, has been broken down by a privation of the goodness of the apple. In other words, evil in this sense is the rot on the apple. To use it in a more, perhaps, personal sense, evil is not an opposing force of good, but rather evil is the absence or the deformation of good, such that, in Augustine's case, I desire to eat because I'm hungry. The desire to eat is a good thing because I'm wanting to make my body healthy. However, the desire to eat too much, gluttony, or the desire to emaciate myself, which is the opposite of gluttony, is in fact an evil. Not because my desire for food is evil, but because evil is the privation of that good approach to a good taking care of my body. The good that I am trying to direct my will towards is distorted by whatever forms of evil that we want to talk about here, distorted by my personal misunderstanding, by society, perhaps. But something along the lines of me being able to perceive the good of taking care of my body is distorted in some ways, such that I eat too much or eat too little, and therefore I become unhealthy, both in the overeating or in the undereating sense. Instead, what Augustine is going to say is that no, there is a level at which we have to perceive the good of the world, the good of me eating in order to maintain my health. But we have to be able to say that it's not the physical stuff. It's not the food that I eat that's afflicting me. It's not even if I get food poisoning, by the way, it's not the food that I eat that's afflicting me. It's the evil that is at work that is distorting the good of the food that makes me sick. There is a non-substance. Evil is non-substantial, whereas good is substantial. And therefore, Augustine is going to say the physical created universe, as Genesis chapters 1 and 2 say, the physical created universe is good. because God creates after God's own nature. God can never create evil. But there can be opposition to the good in the simple distortion of the good, and therefore distortion happens to something that is good. This is the other key observation that Augustine makes here. There cannot be distortion if there is not goodness to begin with. This is actually a really key insight that I think we as Christians sometimes lose. There cannot be distortion unless there's good to start with. There cannot be a distortion of the good unless we already have something good that we're working with to begin with. There cannot be rot. There cannot be a distortion of something unless we start with something that truly is useful, something that truly is good for us. And in that way, when Augustine begins to make these connection points, the Word makes sense to Augustine. And the Word made flesh makes more sense to Augustine, because God, who, as Augustine says, he holds to classical theism, in that if God is perfect, then God cannot be subject to evil. And if God is perfectly good, then there is no rot in God. There is no affliction in God. There's no sickness in God. And because evil is completely, evil is a distortion or privation of that is good, if God is the ultimate source of good, God cannot deprive himself of himself. It's a logical contradiction for those things to happen. And if that's the case, then that means that although the universe is created good, the universe is a created thing that is subject to these forces in a different way than God is. In other words, God is not simply a part of the world. God's not simply the best of all creation. God's not simply the best of anything that's out there. When I can imagine the best thing possible in the universe, God is not that. God is beyond that. God is beyond the physical universe and beyond what mere physical description, or really what mere description of the universe can mean. God's beyond that. And because of that, God is not subject to the distortions of the good that we are subject to because of our lesser being. We are a creation of God, but that does not mean that we are not subject to an exterior force to us, or really a rot force against us, of which God is not particularly subject to. And because of that, the Word makes more sense to Augustine. And as he begins his Platonic quest, there's one other key difference that he's going to discover that, again, begins to push him more and more towards Christianity. Whereas the difference between how Platonists talk about evil, so also what Augustine does not find in the Platonists is repentance. Suffering is an aspect in which God, in Christ Jesus, was made subject to the powers of evil, so that, in the perfect sense of the word, we could be made good. We did not have any power in ourselves to be good, in and of ourselves. Because again, all goodness comes from God. Our creation comes from God. Our goodness comes from God. Even our will to the good, as Augustine is going to get to here in a little bit, our will to do good comes from God. And without God, who is the perfect good, without the perfect good, we are simply subject to rot. We are subject to privations of good. We're subject to distortions of good, and often those distortions of good are caused by, as Augustine is going to postulate, the funkiness of our own nature. But in a more, I think, important sense, Augustine is going to postulate that the reason why we're afflicted by this is because of the opposition of our wills. The internal will is a deep-seated place in which opposition to God really manifests itself. And the will for Augustine is a key player in Augustinian theology, and will be a key player in Christian theology for thousands of years after Augustine, in that Augustine's deep search and conception for what it means to talk about something as evil is going to really be closely reflected in what it means to have a deficient will. And the will is where we're going to locate that. Not in the physical thing, the physical stuff of the universe, but in the wills of humanity, in the wills that actively oppose the good, the perfect good that God is. Today was a lot. This chapter is a lot. Again, this is either your favorite chapter or your least favorite chapter, but this is a key place for Augustine where he begins to differentiate himself from his younger life to where he is now. And also where he self-confessedly is becoming more and more convinced of the truth of Christianity. And it's in these really important distinctions of what is evil, what's the nature of the physical universe, what's the nature of God, what's God's relationship to the physical universe, what's God's relationship to evil. These are key points for Augustine that's going to continue to inform the ways that he views the world, but also the ways in which he is going to interpret theology, in which he's going to really begin to create a systematic doctrinal theology that's going to really be the bedrock of a lot of Christian theology, of Christian tradition, well all the way to our current time period. And it is in these particular discussions in which we as Christians can gain the ability to say fully what scriptures say. That the world really is good. The world's not trying to deceive me. That God has created the world good. But rather that the world is still afflicted by a privation of that which is good. Something that is deficient of the good. Something that is distorted of the good. Or, to use it in the modern sense, something that takes existence away from that which exists. Or dehumanizes the human. Everyone is created good, but there is a subjecting to evil that dehumanizes us, that de-goodifies us, basically. And that's where redemption comes in. That's where redemption becomes a key theology, not just for Augustine, but for us as Christians. And that's where Augustine's slow move towards Christianity is going to come to its fruition in the person of who Jesus is, in relationship to the redemption of the physical universe from that deprivation of the good that we call evil.